So, hello everyone. So this talk is going to be slightly more cognitive heavy. So do stop me if you have any questions. But I'm going to be looking at examining belief updating in this charge context, using Bayesian networks specifically. So I don't need to tell you guys. So we know that people often update their beliefs in seemingly irrational ways. And this is the case, for example, when we witness polarization, where given the same evidence to individuals, they might update their beliefs in opposing directions. And this is particularly an issue with the growing rise and threat of misinformation, which we know can influence memory, reasoning, and decision-making, after which has been clearly corrected. And this effect is called the continued influence effect. And we wanted to take a closer look at the effect in some of the studies we run to see if people are actually updating their beliefs in this irrational way, or if there are some underlying mechanisms that can better explain why people engage in these behaviors. So in a recent paper that we ran, published in Cognition, we ran a few studies to look at this relationship. And we created this bribery vignette, and we gave individuals a bribery claim and a bribery correction. And we manipulated the trustworthiness and expertise of the sources making the claim and making the correction. And we actually found that when updating their beliefs, individuals went back to baseline and corrected their beliefs if they thought that the correcting source was reliable or more reliable than the source making the claim. So if you look at the top passage, you will see that when the correcting source is an H, so the second letter is an H, the drop in the belief in the claim is sharper than when the source is less reliable. So we found that people updated their beliefs in quite a reasonable manner, in a reasonable way. Now, obviously, one key limitation of this study is that we gave participants a vignette that was a bribery vignette, but still quite neutral. Individuals didn't have a vested interest to keep on believing this incorrect information, right? So we see that they're capable of doing this updating when it's quite neutral. But the question is, what would happen in a politically charged context? Would individuals still update their beliefs in this seemingly rational way when we add some kind of politicized information? And to answer this question, we conducted some Bayesian network modeling and some structural equation modeling. Now, why these two types of methods? So Bayesian network modelings kind of provide a normative framework of how people update their beliefs. And they create a good rational benchmark to see if people update their beliefs rationally. And I'll explain this further, but the key idea is that a rational agent will update their beliefs based on their prior beliefs and how diagnostic or persuasive they find the evidence that they receive. On the other side, structural equation modeling is more of a descriptive model. So to look at which factors do people take into account when they update their beliefs. And so hopefully with these two types of model, we would answer the question of if people update their beliefs rationally in these politicized contexts. So in terms of the study, we had a US sample of 200 participants, evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And we gave participants this vignette about this politician, Henry Light, who's running for re-election. And in the middle of his campaign, a prosecutor states that Henry Light has taken a bribe. And at the end of the vignette, a different prosecutor states that the bribery actually didn't happen. And crucially, we manipulated whether Henry Light, our politician, was identified as a Republican or a Democrat. And we collected information about people's belief in the bribe at 3 points in time. So before the claim was made, after the claim, and after the correction. And we wanted to see if these belief updates followed rational patterns elicited by the Bayesian network model. So if you haven't worked with Bayesian network models before, so this is the a priori model we constructed. So the premise here is that the likelihood of the claim happening is a function of two things: whether the bribery happened or not in the real world, and whether the reliability of the source is high or low, so whether they're reliable or unreliable. And this is the same for the claim one, so the claim that the bribery occurred, and claim two, that it didn't occur. So how this works is that we collected all participant information to parameterize this model. And then this model creates an output, which we compare to what participants actually did to see if what they did aligns with this rational model. So we compare these two patterns. So to construct this model, we gave participants a set of conditional probability questions. So these were a function of whether the bribery occurred or not, and whether the claim, whether the source was reliable or not. So these look something like this. So if Henry Light had taken the bribe and the prosecutor was reliable, how likely is it that he would report that the bribery occurred? And the same if the bribery had not happened. And we do the full factorial with the bribery happening and the source being unreliable, and the bribery not happening and the source being unreliable. So these are quite tricky questions. So we obviously gave participants loads of time to answer them with extensive instructions. But if you want to take a second to think about how you'd answer, I think participants were quite good at this. So the key idea is, if the prosecutor is reliable, they would report what happens in the real world. So if they're reliable and the claim didn't happen, they would say it didn't happen. Well, if they were reliable and the bribery happened, they would say the bribery did happen. If they're unreliable, this is a bit more tricky. So you can have different unreliable sources. They either say whatever they want, independent of what happens in the world, or they say the opposite, right? And in general, participant kind of average around 50-50. So they would probably say whatever they want, independent of what happened, not just necessarily the opposite of what happened. Okay, so we took all these questions and we used them to parameterize the model. And now I'm going to show you the comparison between what people actually answered in this vignette and what the model suggests. So this is what we found. So in this graph, you have on the x-axis the 3 different time points. So this is time point 0 before the claim, time point 1 after the claim, and time point 2 after the correction. And on the y-axis, we have the average belief in the bribe. The 2 facets here, congruent and congruent, signify whether individuals saw a politician that was an in-group member or an out-group member. So in the congruent condition, individuals found a politician or an in-group member independent of their political affiliation, right? So this is including both Republicans and Democrats. And the dotted line here, you see the model predictions, and while the bold line is what we actually found. So we found that individuals updated their beliefs in response to the evidence. So they kind of go up when they receive the claim, but they also go back to baseline after they receive the correction. So here we don't see any effects of the continued influence effect because people go back to their own baseline before they evidence the claim. So individuals also update, at least qualitatively, with the Bayesian predictions. We see that they are more conservative than the model predicts, which is in line with the literature. But at the time point 2, we see there's no difference between the model and the real predictions. One other key aspect here is that we don't find any difference between Republicans and Democrats in this subset of how they update their beliefs. Obviously, as you can see from this graph, when in the incongruent condition, so when individuals are assessing the likelihood of a bribe of an out-group politician, their prior beliefs start way higher and they also end way higher. So basically, there is a weight of people's political beliefs, but it doesn't affect their ability to correct the information that they were given. Great, so individuals, in terms of beliefs, update their beliefs quite rationally, at least qualitatively in line with the model. Okay, so we also conducted some exploratory analysis on subgroups that self-identified as extreme or moderate. This was not pre-registered, so this is just exploratory, but we took a scale that went from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, and we kind of grouped together the extremes of the scale to look at self-identified extremism. There are better scales to identify extremism, and in this case, this is what we have. And we looked at their belief updating, and we do find that individuals who self-identified as extreme had harsher belief updates when they received the claim of an out-group member, but they also went back to baseline after they received the correction. So even if their prior beliefs were higher and their updates were harsher, they still managed to go back to baseline after the correction, which is quite surprising. That baseline obviously is way higher than someone that identifies as moderate. In terms of reliability, the picture is quite different. So this assesses the reliability of the sources making the claim. So time point 0 would be the reliability of a prosecutor in general. Time point 1 would be the prosecutor making the claim, and time point 2 would be the prosecutor making a correction. So once again, the dotted line is the model, and on the y-axis we have the average reliability of each source.
Can we go back to the extremists for a second? I'm just curious about that. So the extremists are more sensitive.
Yeah.
I might have expected the opposite. Extremists would have such strong priors that they might be less sensitive.
Yeah, I mean, there was no key difference in the congruent condition. In the incongruent condition, this is an outgrouped politician. So they already have a higher prior of whether this politician would take a bribe. And then as soon as you tell them, they kind of like are like, told you, you're right. Yeah. So, but they still kind of go back to baseline after the correction. In the congruent condition, they do have like slightly steeper line, which is what would be surprising here. But there's no real like statistical significance. This could be just noise, and it would have to be replicated with different extremist scales.
Okay, so there's no statistical difference in sensitivity. It's just
it's not in sensitivity in general. Like there is a difference in sensitivity from yeah.
Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to think, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, and this is just my assumption, is that extremists not only start with an assumption that the outgroup is going to do bad things, but they have really strong beliefs about that, and so I would expect them to be less sensitive overall because they are down in the rabbit hole all day long, reading bad things about the other group, and so they should kind of be pretty set. Like no new single piece of information should move them around. Whereas you might expect that people who are more neutral or ambivalent, new information should move their judgments around a lot because they don't have really strong judgments in general. Not only not negative about the outgroup, but just not well developed.
Like a ceiling effect.
Yeah, like, well, you could have a ceiling effect, or just like, if I believe that the sky is blue, no new information should change my belief that the sky is blue. Whereas you drop an alien on Earth who hasn't really explored the world, and you tell them the sky's blue, and they're like, oh yeah, the sky's blue, I guess.
True. I mean, it's interesting. It depends, first of all, on your definition of extremists. Like this was literally people that self-identified on the extreme of the scale. This doesn't mean that they're more closed-minded necessarily, but they just strongly identify with their.
Well, I'll say this. So this is a study we have with Americans, representative sample. This is Elizabeth Harris when she was in my lab. Extremism, people at the extremes of ideology on the left or right, tend to be way more score higher on dogmatism.
Definitely.
Which is rigidity in general and closed-mindedness. So there is good reason, a priori from our data and other data, to think that they're more closed-minded.
True, but if you look at this, this is a probability scale, right?
Yeah.
So if you ask people, what is the likelihood that any given outgroup politician would take a bribe, like unless you're completely unreasonable, you wouldn't start at 100. Like you're just like 100% sure that every single outgroup politician, like maybe there's people thinking that, but on an average sample, I think it's quite unlikely for someone to start at 100, which then you wouldn't update.
That is a ceiling effect. That's what Brandon is trying to do.
So in this
clearly
case,
they're not at the ceiling on average.
they're not ceiling, but this could be also due to individual variability, right? Like there could be a couple of people at the ceilings you can't really see like the individual points, but there's clearly some people up here that you probably wouldn't move. But the key idea is that if you start with a pretty high prior, like this is any given, like this is a random politician, all you know about this fictional politician, it's not even a real politician, is that they are the outgroup, and your prior belief that they took a bribe is about like 60%, way more likely to take a bribe than not.
Okay, so maybe the key issue here is that this is a fictional politician, so you might assume that they're negative, but you don't really know that much about them, so you're pretty flexible to the information. Whereas if it was Donald Trump, people have such strong beliefs about him that they would be less sensitive, extremists, maybe?
So yeah, that all depends on how sticky your priors are.
That's kind of what I'm guessing. I just assume that extremists have sticky priors, but your data suggests the opposite.
Right, well, but this is a fictional politician, bear in mind, right? So basically this just shows that people update their beliefs in line with their prior and how diagnostic they find the evidence. So if their prior is very strong or very high, as you see, like when people update their beliefs, they go back to the prior. So even when you say this fictional politician did not take a bribe, people are still 60% likely that he took a bribe. So they're not being that kind of flexible where you're like, oh, okay. But this is rational kind of in their own line of reasoning because of how strong their priors are. So we're not saying that this is a reasonable base rate of belief, right? Statistically, this is probably an inaccurate base rate of how likely any given politician is to take a bribe, or I would hope so. But the key idea is that in line with how they perceive their own priors, this is a reasonable way to update their beliefs. And they are still kind of updating their beliefs, the individuals that identify as extreme, more harshly or more steeply than kind of if you have an average belief in that the politician took a bribe, right? So the key idea here is not that people are making real kind of reasonable judgments in the world about the likelihood, or that they even know what the base rate of this likelihood is, but they are kind of making that update based on what they already believe, and they are adjusting it if you do kind of correct that that idea. Yes.
Okay, question. Did you recompute the model estimates separately for these two samples, the moderate and extreme? Like,
Yeah.
do they adhere to like they may show slightly different patterns or whatever, but maybe they
will
both adhere subjectively to their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they do both adhere to
Okay.
that. So like always, this is all not what we expected and not what we kind of progressed with. But yeah, the key idea is that even individuals that identified as extreme, they kind of were in line with their prior beliefs and how diagnostic they found the evidence.
Yeah.
So once again, when you talk about rationality, this is an internal rationality based on individual parameters. It's not an externally kind of, you're using the right things that make your beliefs. Okay, so kind of just to look through the reliability now. So this is similar, but on the reliability judgments to see the model versus the real values. And we find that in the congruent condition, individuals actually rated the reliability of the source making the claim way lower than the model predicted. And they were way steeper in their downgrade of reliability, which, as we mentioned before, usually people tend to be more conservative than the model predicts. So here they're more harsh than the model predicts. And this downgrade obviously is not as steep when you have someone attacking an out-group politician. So obviously people rated any given prosecutor that attacks the in-group member as being way less reliable than someone attacking the out-group member, which is what you would expect. In the congruent condition, participants do at least qualitatively align with the model, right? But in the incongruent condition, they actually go the different direction than the model predicts. So the model states, if you have a high prior that something will happen, and someone says that thing will happen, you should probably strengthen your reliability in that person, right? But individuals downgraded it nonetheless. So this idea is that probably the context in which this claim occurred either leads to a general heuristic or a perception of bias of the individual making the claim. So you are in a politicized kind of environment, someone makes this claim, you know that most likely this claim could be politically motivated. So you don't necessarily downgrade your reliability in them that much, but you also don't necessarily increase your reliability in them because of the context. So this is quite interesting because it's almost like going against like a potential bias, right? So yes. And finally, just to quickly go through the structural equation model. So once again, where the Bayesian network model is a normative model of people's internal kind of belief updating, this is a descriptive model of what things individuals might keep into account when updating their beliefs. So we have belief in the verb at 3 points in time, and we posit that the belief at each point is dependent on the reliability of the source making the claim, and in turn, the expertise and trustworthiness of the source. What we want to do here is compare this model with our data to a model that includes worldview congruence at one or multiple of these stages. So we want to see if the fact that this is a claim that aligns or doesn't align with our worldview will affect how well this model fits the data that we have. So this is the symmetry. So we do find that source evaluation is identified as one of the key predictors of revision. So people do keep into account the reliability of the sources. However, we didn't find that worldview adds any significant predictive power to this model. So we know that worldview has an effect on prior beliefs. As we see, people have different priors depending on whether this is in-group or out-group. But adding worldview didn't strengthen the model to a degree to which adding it would be justified, right? So in general, from this data, we find that when people relied on their beliefs, And when people update their beliefs, they rely more on their existing opinions and the reliability of the sources than whether the information fit with their worldview. Now, what does this mean? So in terms of priors, we know that worldview affects priors, but the individual variability of those priors is not captured entirely by worldview, right? So it's captured by a lot of other things, considering like your beliefs about politician, of the context, of anything else. So adding it to the model didn't strengthen it, or it wasn't justified.
Sorry, how did you,
Yeah.
I just want to clarify this.
Yeah.
How did you measure worldview? Like, what were the?
So in this case, worldview is literally just, is this piece of information, is this an algo brain with politician? It's like a binary, right?
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's just, is this somebody part of your political party?
Basically, yeah. So it doesn't kind of include a lot of other things that might be like worldview related, right? View of the world, like, well, obviously your worldview can be everything that you view of the world.
And then how did you differentiate that from the prior opinions?
So basically we have a measure, like none of these are kind of latent, they're measured variables. So we have their belief at baseline, which is we give them this politician, we give them an intro of what kind of a person he is, and then we ask them how likely they are to take a bribe before any claim is made. So that's the kind of prior.
And that's before they know the group membership of the
No,
politician?
after they know the group membership.
So I guess what I'm assuming though is that the reason worldview is not doing anything later is because it's fully baked into.
Well, so
prior opinion.
that's what we thought. So that's why we initially had worldview just as a predictor of prior, right? I mean, that's already a very interesting finding because you're saying how people update their beliefs is not a function of, like, people don't update in different ways depending on whether this is an in-group arc or member. So that's really quite interesting. But we thought that at least adding it as a predictor of prior belief would kind of do something. But the key idea is that it does something in terms of like a regression, right? But if you add it to the model, it's basically not justified adding that extra parameter. So this, or the model with the source reliability, is a better model to capture the data. So in terms of prior, it's basically like the prior belief. Yes, worldview is kind of captured in that, but there's also a lot of other things captured in that, which means that worldview is not as strong a predictor of prior belief as other things going on there that don't justify it.
I don't know if that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay.
It it just seems like it's from a regression perspective, you have collinearity. You have two variables that are capturing the same thing, and that you put one in the model and then later you add the other one in the model. It's not going to add any variance because it's already the same thing. So for example, in the literature on politics, you have this with ideology and partisan identity. They're correlated at like 0.8. And so whichever one you put in the model first just predicts everything, and whatever you put later doesn't really add any variance because they're soaking up shared variance.
Yeah, I think the key idea of adding it as a function of, like, basically as a parent of prior belief is that in theory you get worldview, and then that causes prior belief, and then that causes second belief, right? That would be
That's kind of what I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I'm assuming your judgments of, you take a novel politician, your predictions about that politician are based on your pre-existing identities and ideologies and stuff.
And that is true, like, right? So we do see that worldview does feed into prior belief, and it's a significant regression.
Okay.
But basically, when you talk about the model itself, because prior belief is based on a number of different factors, including worldview, basically it's not justified to be added to the model. That doesn't mean that people don't consider it.
Okay.
It just means.
Okay, I understand. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, no.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what you're saying.
Okay, so in terms of the conclusions we have here, so we do find that additional individuals show quasi-Bayesian belief updating, even though more conservative, and we don't find any specific difference in updating patterns between Republicans and Democrats, just between out-group and in-group. And even individuals who identify as extreme actually turn to baseline after the correction. And in terms of reliability, we see that participants downgraded the accuser's reliability in all conditions, although they were harsher in the congruent condition. And in the incongruent condition, they might have relied on a heuristic that wasn't captured by the Bayesian network model, but could be captured by different models that include perception of bias of the source, for example, not just reliability. And finally, we find that belief updating was better explained by individuals' prior beliefs and their perception of source reliability than necessarily by the congruence of the claim with their worldview. So in sum, given this evidence, our conclusions here are that instead of assuming bias necessarily at the start, we can assume that people can behave rationally, and then from that see where they deviate from rational updating. But at the basis of this, in the experimental setting, people are capable of updating their beliefs in a rational kind of manner. And yes, if you're interested in the paper, this is the QR code. Yes.
Very interesting. So you find that people are mostly rational, but where might motivated reasoning, identity-based like irrationality play into this, considering your findings? Like when might you find motivated reasoning will occur? Because you don't seem to find it here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a slide here this is a model constructed by, who would I say, but it was provided by Joseph Sommer. I think he's with the US as well. But basically the key idea, and I do appreciate this model itself, is that belief updating up there is almost this black box where individuals do update their beliefs rationally. And when we talk rationally, it's more like resource rationality, not pure rationality. So constrained by the resources people have, they are able to kind of update their beliefs in this rational way. And then on top of that, you have these cognitive processes, and these involve, your reasoning, your acceptance, evidence search, these kind of things. And then basically on top of that, you have these relatively invariant characteristics. So this is where your goals, emotions, your representing, your kind of thinking dispositions come in. So the idea is that although you can't just believe what you want, right? So you can't go out there and believe in something that you really want, or that you're like the smartest person in the world, right? You have to gather evidence in support of that. But what you can do is that because you have certain goals and emotions, you can affect your evidence search, for example, or acceptance. So let's say I am a specific participant in a political party. So I will look for my evidence in specific news sources, and then I'll be able to update my beliefs based on that evidence that is based on my goals. So I think what we're looking here, we're not saying these things don't happen. We're saying that at this level, people are capable of doing that updating. And that's still kind of a new finding, because a lot of people looked at the CIE and said, people are incapable of doing this. People have some memory limitations. So they're not cognitively able to do this updating when we correct the information. But people are able to. They just kind of use these strategies so that their belief updating will be in line with their goals and emotions and their political orientation and such. Basically, this is where this would all fit in according to this model, which you can kind of believe or not. And I think this is an interesting finding to me, because it means that if you manage in some way to like tweak and adjust some environmental effects or some environmental factors, then you would be able to reach somewhat resource rational updating. But the problem is obviously all these things occur. But so if I took on any given person and kind of managed to in some way have low priors on something and give them exact reliable evidence, they wouldn't reject it necessarily, right? So if they found that the source was reliable, which is already something, and you give them evidence that is persuasive, they will update their beliefs. So they can't just like decide that they don't want to believe something, right? So yes.
So are you saying that goals come in more at the level of like source selection, basically like a Republican choosing to watch Fox News and then they update their beliefs in
yes, or acceptance as well. So it can be that I scrutinize out-group arguments more than I scrutinize in-group arguments. So I could put like loads of effort into looking at the source of something and finding reasons for why they're terrible. But as soon as I receive an in-group claim, I'm like, yeah, this seems reasonable enough, right? Use less cognitive resources because this is not in line with your goals.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. That reminds me of Brockman and Callis field experiments, where they find that if you take frequent Fox News viewers and you make them watch CNN, they update their beliefs a lot and they like change their opinions about Trump and everything like that. But then as soon as the experiment's over, they choose to watch Fox News again.
Right,
so
exactly.
It seems like motivation plays a role in choosing to like watch a certain channel, but people update their beliefs like mostly rationally in response to seeing different things.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think this evidence kind of does too. And there is a utility of belonging to a group that we've already discussed. So, it makes sense that people would want the evidence that aligns with their goals. Right.